Cards have honestly been a part of my life for as long as I can remember, and they've always held a special place in my heart. Most of my friendships are also connected to cards in some way, and now it's also partly a business for me. So these cards have been around in various forms, but practically all my life. And how did these cards even appear? Well, we have to go back to the 90s, the year of 1998, 1999. I was 9 years old then. I was in the third grade of elementary school. And then two things appeared. Well, appeared, of course, means that someone brought them to the yard. Someone brought them to school. Someone else heard someone had something, and you could see it at recess. That's how things appeared. First, Pokemon appeared. And Pokemon took the world by storm because they appeared in the form of cards, they appeared in the form of plushies, sharpeners, erasers, some total junk, really. I had everything. But I think that Pokemon really, truly introduced not just one, but actually two things to the world of children. And those were Tazo tokens and chips, and the cartoon, which was shown 3 or 4 times a week, and maybe even 5 times a week at one point. At 15:30 on public television. This is very important because in the days of my childhood, we had like 3 or 4 public television channels. And that was the channel where Pokemon aired. On another one, which was like satellite. So actually, well, I didn't have satellite, for example, so I didn't have access to that channel. But I know that Dragon Ball was being shown on RTL back then. And those were basically two camps, Pokemon and Dragon Ball. I wanted to be in the Dragon Ball camp a bit more, but I didn't have a damn clue what Dragon Ball was. So I actually had to be in the Pokemon camp. And I was. Then, after the tokens and the cartoon, one of the things that appeared was Pokemon cards. Pokemon cards appeared almost exclusively in the form of fakes. And interestingly, and funnily enough, I don't think we've made much progress since then when it comes to fakes in general. I have no idea why that is. But the truth is that that cardboard, that scrap paper, had a similar quality to these new fakes. I don't know why it's not profitable to counterfeit over there in China these cards, Pokemon cards, but I guess it's just more profitable for them to print this scrap, these boxes from AliExpress, these rags sent for a few dozen dollars. This is apparently being snapped up all over the world by parents buying those cheaper Pokemon cards for their children. So that's probably more profitable for them. And for me, for someone who sometimes deals with high-value cards, well, all the better, because there are apparently no good fakes. It's not worth it, and that's great. Generally, I'd like to say someone who knows anything about this hobby won't likely mistake a fake box for a real one. But that's exactly what the second story will be about. Not today, but it's coming. A very good one. However, Pokemon appeared. Pokemon showed up as knockoffs. Then they also appeared as originals. In the very first hypermarket that opened in my city, the Giant chain. A chain that's gone now, I think, at this point. I mean, someone probably bought it out, changed the name. Anyway, it's pretty much gone. Pokemon appeared, first as fakes, then as originals in the first hypermarket in my city, the Jean chain. A chain that's gone now. I mean, someone probably bought it out, changed the name, but anyway, it's gone. Well, but in those hypermarkets, Pokemon cards appeared, and it was base set, not first edition. Base set was being sold, and I was ripping base set boosters. Specifically 2 boosters, because that's all I could afford back then. Well, my mom wasn't particularly happy about spending that money, but I remember I opened 2 boosters, and I didn't get any holos. However, moving away from Pokemon, Magic cards also appeared. Interestingly, Magic cards appeared in a computer magazine. The magazine was called World of Computer Games. And there was always a disc attached with demos on it, some tutorials on how to use Notepad on a computer, right? Well, they also added a Magic deck to that magazine, a starter deck. Now, I know that starter deck was cards from Portal 3 Kingdoms packed into some starter packaging and included as a way to promote Magic. And getting it was incredibly difficult. The magazine didn't cost much, about the equivalent of $5. But the stores were empty of that magazine, and it wasn't even scalpers. Besides, I don't think anyone blamed scalpers back then. I don't know if people didn't think to resell it for more, or maybe, I don't know, there were no places to trade such things. So people just bought what they wanted for themselves or friends. There was just no way to get it. And I suffered terribly because of it, because I loved such cool new things. Cards really excited me, and I learned to play simple games with regular cards with my dad quite quickly. And then Magic just really fascinated me. I really wanted to get it, to manage to buy that starter, but I couldn't. A month had passed, there were New World of Computer games, the old ones were gone. It was gone, I'll never play Magic. But a big thing happens, very surprising. Namely, we find out, or someone finds out and spreads this rumor, that the school library is selling that magazine. And get this, not for 20, but for 6 zloty. Well, it didn't sound like likely information. I mean, a school library trading, even in books, is fine, but trading a magazine with cards included is a very abstract idea. But I was so baited that I went. Anyway, if they laugh at me, so be it. But it's a shame to waste such a chance, if there's even a 5% chance it's true. I walk into that library, and yes, there they are, 3 magazines lying there, 6 Lottie stickers on them, plain as day. I pull out the 6 Lottie, and no, I ran home for money and came back with 10 Zloty. I even kept asking the lady if she'd stay open because it was right before the Christmas break. Well, I bought that magazine. Man, I played with that deck so much. I played with my dad, I played with friends, before school, after school, in schools, on windowsills. We played with those decks everywhere. And it was pretty fun, though a bit frustrating, because those decks were short, and generally it was harder to kill each other than to deck out. And we didn't play with the rule that you lose if you deck out back then, so those matches sometimes ended like that, without a finale, which was a kind of frustrating feeling, as you can imagine. And the phase for Magic had passed a bit, but that's when I discovered, or rather heard, well, from someone a few months later, that there's this shop in my town where you can buy individual Magic cards. It sounded like a fairy tale. It meant that the cards that existed were great, but there were even more of them. And if there are more, there could be twice as many, or even more than twice as many. I was obsessed with the thought that you could buy more of these cards. And I managed to find out from some friend who knew a friend who bought cards there that it was happening in a bookstore on Lausiana Street. Lausiana is the street in the town where I grew up. And there are 3 bookstores there, which my mom told me about. She was always very, very well acquainted with all kinds of architecture in that town, all the little businesses in town, and things like bookstores on Lausiana were no challenge for her. So she took me to the first one where they looked at me like I was an idiot. I mean, I was 10 years old, so I didn't really understand it yet. In the second one, they also treated me like an idiot. But in the third one, an older lady in her 80s, earning some extra money on top of her pension, looked at me when I asked the question, "Hello, do you sell individual cards for the game Magic the Gathering?" She looked at me and said, "We don't sell them." But there's supposedly a stationery shop near the monument downtown where those cards are sold. And I'm thinking, unbelievable, unbelievable. Not only does this shop actually exist, but I also know where it is. So we left that bookstore quickly. My town isn't particularly big, so 4 minutes later we were at that place. And I asked in that stationery shop if they sell individual Magic cards. It turned out they did. A terribly rude student. It's actually super funny that this guy worked in that shop with those magics. Everyone has known him for many, many years. He was a student who was just an employee of the owner, the oh-so-distinguished Mr. Bednarik, but he was incredibly rude. Just incredibly rude. Work was simply the worst kind of torture for him, so he went off, grumbling like that, to the back of the warehouse. He brought out a binder, World of Knowledge. That was a magazine back then where, well, you'd collect it in a binder, you'd buy it, put it in. There were all these smart things in there. People didn't read it, but they bought it because they wanted to think of themselves as the type who read that stuff, and they wanted others to think they were the type who read that stuff. Nobody read it. And in the binder from that, well, there were these binders because people bought them and then they were just useless. So this guy actually had these long pages, standard ones from those cheap binders, stuffed with magic cards for 80 cents, $2, 5 and 10 zloty. While I was in heaven, I had a bit over 4 zloty there. Now, it's not a lot of money, but I knew that with that money, I could buy cards to add to my existing decks. And that would at least let me finish games. So I bought a few commons there for 80 groszy each. And as word got around that such a shop actually existed, well, everyone started going there. Because, of course, I told everyone about it. A lot of my friends went there, and it seems the card trading itself made the owner realize that maybe next time, instead of 2 boxes, which was probably the usual order then, he could order 4, or even 6. Players started showing up. These players were an older group, about 6 or 7 years older than me, so I didn't really hang out with them. Magic, once again, became a big part of my life when I changed schools. Because generally back then, primary school lasted 6 years, and then you moved on to the next stage, a 3-year stage, middle school. And in the first grade, one of my classmates, who, let's be honest, I didn't really like much back then, but magic brought us together, among other things, because he had a brother who played magic and would bring cards from a completely different city, and I had my deck and the stuff I'd bought from Bednarik, some knowledge of the game, and a real passion for it. And then 2 or 3 more people joined in the fun. It turned out there was also a much older guy at our school who was already playing Magic competitively. He went to the Polish championships, big tournaments, Grand Prix, just incredible stuff back then. And he kind of introduced us to it, brought binders, and sold us his cards. And then I heard that a tournament was being organized in our city, a Magic the Gathering tournament. God, I was so happy because first of all, I loved Magic, and secondly, I had an absolute beast of a deck, a mono red deck with Shivan Dragons and Stone Rains. And at the time, I couldn't fathom that stronger cards could even exist in the game, you know? I was 13 years old, so my perspective on things was a bit limited, you know? Anyway, I showed up at this tournament incredibly hyped up, and I just got completely wiped off the face of the earth. I lost every single match, every game, and I didn't really put up much of a fight. Oh wait, I did win against one of my friends, yeah. He lost to me and all his other matches, but he won one game against Affinity because in those random cards we bought for 80 cents, some energy fluxes were tucked away. Those cards were in that. For people who play Magic, Energy Flux is a pretty well-known card, I think. Pay 2 during upkeep or you have to sacrifice for every artifact. And for those who don't play Magic, let's just say Energy Flux is a card that absolutely destroys any strategy for a deck based on artifacts. Now, an artifact is a certain type of card in Magic, and there's a deck that uses only those artifacts, meaning only cards of that type. So this card is exceptionally effective against it. And there was this player who had Affinity, or a deck completely based on artifacts. He lost the second and third games after sideboarding to a blue deck that was killing with Spire Golems in Extended. Because from the sideboard, we figured out back then that we could play energy fluxes. So each of us won 1 match. But we lost 6 each. So the start was just absolutely nightmarish. I remember when I got back after that tournament, I turned on the internet. Back then, it's still connected through a cable. You know, that funny sound it made? And I remember the reason I got online and started using it on a larger scale, back then, hardly anyone even had an email inbox. The internet was such that you could chat on instant messengers, and sure, it was popular, but it wasn't that widespread yet. Among my group of friends, the internet was used rather rarely. So I went online specifically to look for Magic cards, and I found those Magic cards, and I found an amazing community. It turned out there was a community in my city, and 2 large communities in my country organizing various meetups and events. And that's how this whole life started. So, well, the history of Magic began at a tournament. A story, a big story, started with an absolutely nightmarish experience at a tournament. And when I often think about it now, for instance, when new players show up at the store for the first time, I try to actively think about making their first experience with the game very pleasant, to sort of guide them through the game a bit, to offer advice on how best to approach the game, how best to arrange cards on the table, and how to handle all that table etiquette. I love doing it, but I think to myself that Magic is such an amazing game that despite the fact that I had an absolutely nightmarish first encounter with it, I still fell in love with the game. Or maybe that's exactly why. Maybe that's exactly why.